Good morning, everybody, and a big thanks to Nadia for a really excellent introduction and overview to this topic of voluntary carbon markets. Nadia emphasized that the origin of this was very much in an international context, particularly in terms of trying to increase the flow of carbon finance to developing countries. I want to switch the focus a little bit to the European Union and to bring this focus to the idea of carbon farming, which is an attempt to encourage the growth of a voluntary carbon market, particularly with respect to agricultural and forestry activities. So what I want to do is, first of all, just say a word about why we should be interested in this concept of carbon farming. I'll make just one slide in terms of the debate that Nadia has referred to, around the environmental integrity of these voluntary carbon credits. I'll emphasize, as she did, the role of certification as a way to try to ensure that the credits that come on this voluntary market are of high quality. And I'm going to refer to the most recent piece of European Union legislation, in fact, just published in the official journal last week, so it's just literally hot off the press, which is the European Union's answer to try to ensure that these carbon credits are of high quality. But then I'm going to raise a sort of a question for discussion, which is there really a business case for carbon farming for farmers in particular in the European Union? So why are we interested in this? And this is a graph which comes from the recent impact assessment published by the Commission February this year, when it was looking at a potential target for emission reductions in 2040. So this is a projected pathway to carbon to net zero in 2050. You can see that we will still have some residual emissions in 2050, particularly from the agricultural sector, some also hard to abate emissions in industry. But the idea is that they will be offset by a sink or by carbon removals. Now, some of those, that's the red line here, will be industrial carbon removals, but you can see that the expectation is that the great bulk of these carbon removals will come essentially from the land sector. The difficulty is that if we look at the trend in the carbon removals from the land sector, so this is in the national inventories referred to as the LULUCF sector in English at least, and I'm going to use a lot of English acronyms. I'll try to explain them as we go along, but the land use, change and forestry sector, you can see the net sink is the black line here, and you can see that that has been shrinking for quite some time. Now, it's dominated by forestry, so what we observe here is acceleration in the cutting of forests for increased biomass use, but we also see the impact of climate change, wildfires, drought, and so on affecting the carbon biomass in the forest stock. You'll see here the 2030 target, which is set in the so-called LULUCF regulation. It's a legally binding target on member states to achieve a sink of 310 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and you can see that we're actually trending in completely the wrong direction. Part of that is to do with the fact that the situation with respect to agricultural land use, so this is croplands and grasslands, is actually a net contributor to emissions. Largely because of organic soils, it's true, but still, if we want to try to achieve that overall target in the land use sector, then we also should try to focus on reducing that total of net emissions from croplands and grasslands, but also in terms of course, reversing the forestry trend as well. So what is carbon farming? It's essentially then this effort to try to encourage increased carbon removals in the agricultural and forest sector. We can call it, sometimes people refer to it as nature-based solutions. But it's also seen and promoted by the Commission as a way of generating an additional stream of revenue for farmers and foresters. I'm going to focus mainly on farmers. That's more my area of expertise. So those are the two main objectives. So an environmental objective, but also an income objective. And then in addition, again, as Nadia emphasized, there is a concern that it should also contribute to other sustainability objectives, particularly in terms of biodiversity, water resilience, and so on. We now actually have a formal definition of what is carbon farming. It's included in this new regulation that I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. But it's interesting just to look at this official definition. So it's any practice or practices carried out over an activity period of at least 5 years. Okay, so this is not, we're not here talking about permanent carbon removal, such as you might bring about through geological storage of carbon. These can be quite short-term carbon credits, but related to terrestrial or coastal management, so there's a blue carbon element, resulting in capture and temporary storage of atmospheric and biogenic carbon into biogenic carbon pools, or the reduction of soil emissions, which of course is the organic soil element. So it's not only, as defined in this regulation, it's not only about removals, but it's also about reducing some emissions. And you can see here the list of activities that are covered. So afforestation, reforestation, increasing carbon in mineral croplands, increasing carbon stocks in pasture systems, reducing emissions from organic soils, peatlands, increasing carbon in above ground biomass, so this could be agroforestry, it could be hedgerows, reducing soil emissions from nitrous oxide. So that's the addition, if you like, in the definition there. So this is from the interaction, particularly with nitrogen, and also increasing carbon in aquatic farming systems. Now, what the formal definition does not cover at the moment are reducing emissions from livestock farming, either from enteric fermentation or from manure management, nor reducing methane emissions from rice cultivation. Just one slide to emphasize that there is, as Nadia also spoke about, this huge debate around the environmental integrity of these carbon credits. And I've listed here many of the issues that are raised. And this is not the focus of my talk today, but it is important to keep these in mind. And we can come back to these headings, if you like, in the discussion. The response to addressing these concerns about the low quality of many carbon credits, and on the right-hand side you'll see some of the headlines that Nadia has already referred to about the scandals that were revealed by investigative journalism and also by a number of research papers, which basically revealed that companies were paying for hot air. They were simply not getting the reduction in emissions that they thought that they were paying for. And part of the explanation for this is that in this voluntary carbon market, you have a very sort of strange system of perverse incentives. So as Nadia explained, you have project developers, the people who put together the projects, and then you have, if you like, the customers at the other end of the chain. And from the point of view of the project developer, the more credits you can generate, and that means setting, a low bar for the providers of those credits, making it as easy as possible for them to enroll. And then, of course, the customers, they want to get the credits as cheaply as possible. So basically, there's a kind of a perverse incentive system which pushes the quality of credits downwards. The way to address this is, of course, through a rigorous system of certification, that only high-quality credits can be certified and then will be of interest to customers on the market. And as a result of the scandals in 2022, 2023, indeed, the voluntary market players themselves have come together, and there are a number of international efforts to try to improve the quality. But I want to focus in my talk on this new regulation, as I say, just come into force last week within the EU, which is the carbon removals and carbon farming regulation. So the objectives, just to reiterate, is to define quality criteria for carbon removal activities, to ensure that only high quality removals are certified, and the certification methodologies, which will be approved by the Commission, must comply with these requirements. So it sets out a number of sort of basic criteria, and subsequently then there will be developed these what are called methodologies or protocols, which will apply to specific activities that will have to be met by project developers that want to get certification. It also has quite a complex set of arrangements for how that certification will take place. There will be these third-party certifiers, but in turn, they themselves have got to be certified by the national authorities in member states to ensure that the audits that they undertake are indeed of high quality. So the underlying purpose of this regulation is to bring greater credibility, transparency, and environmental integrity to the carbon market, to avoid greenwashing, and in that way, of course, hopefully to attract more private finance. The sort of criteria that are the focus of this new regulation are summed up in this kind of acronym of the quality criteria, and you can see where the four elements contribute to this word quality. So QU stands for quantification. You've obviously got to be able to accurately measure the carbon removals that you are looking for credits for. Additionality, again, Nadia referred to this. There's no point in paying farmers or land managers for activities that they were doing anyway. Basically, if you are a buyer of carbon credits, you want to be assured that you are actually contributing to additional reductions in carbon than would otherwise occur. The L stands for long-term storage. We've seen that, in fact, for carbon farming, this is not going to be the case. These are not permanent removals. But the way that this is addressed in the regulation is that the certificates should clearly account for the duration of carbon storage. So customers who are buying these carbon credits should be absolutely aware of what they are paying for in terms of the length of the duration of the credit. And then the final ITY stands for sustainability, and this is the idea that in paying for carbon credits, buyers should also be contributing to these broader co-benefits of biodiversity, water, and so on. So just a word about how this regulation is likely to work. So the regulation itself, as I say, sets out just these broad basic criteria that the methodologies should observe, but then the methodologies themselves have got to be developed. So if I want to claim carbon credits because I'm increasing my soil organic carbon, what exactly do I have to demonstrate in order to have a high quality credit? So in Brussels, as part of this process, there is a so-called expert group on carbon removals. It's a very transparent process. You can go in on the internet and you can look at the minutes of their meetings. You can look at the documents that have been produced so far. So this expert group is going to come up with draft protocols, draft methodologies, which ultimately then will be signed off by the Commission in a delegated act. And that will then become the the basis for certification under this particular regulation. So the process then would be that the operators, these project developers that Nadia has highlighted, they submit their proposals to a certification scheme, and these certification schemes, they audit the project and say, yes, indeed, we can see that you have met all of the criteria in the protocol. But as I say, these auditing firms, these verifying firms themselves have got to be audited by the national authorities and approved. So it's quite a complex process. We've talked about the coverage, how it goes beyond simple carbon removals to also include these soil emissions, particularly from nitrogen. Importantly, it's a voluntary framework. So the idea is not that these European Union standards are going to become mandatory or the only standards on the market. It'll be up to all of these other standards, and you saw the slide Nadia put up. There's many standards out there. They can apply to be recognized as equivalent to these EU standards, but they can continue to operate independently. So this is a voluntary thing, and the hope is, of course, that these other standards will want to be approved and recognized as meeting the EU standards, because, of course, that will enhance their marketability in the voluntary credit market. And as I say, we now have this very clear distinction between removals which may be permanent, so these would be the industrial removals, distinct from the carbon farming removals, which are very clearly temporary. And also there's the possibility for credits generated by carbon removals in products. Now, the big debate in Brussels as this certification framework regulation was being debated was, how are we going to use these credits? What's the purpose? What will people be able to do with them? And particularly the main concern of the critics was that these carbon farming, these temporary credits, might be used as kind of offsets or compensation, particularly against fossil fuel emissions, which, as we know, are permanent. You know, once you burn your oil, the CO2 emitted remains in the atmosphere for, you know, hundreds, in some cases even longer of years. So the idea that you can use a sort of a 5-year carbon farming credit and say that that is in some sense equivalent to a ton of carbon dioxide emitted from the burning of fossil fuels is something which a lot of people simply could not accept. And similarly, in the case of companies who would be the major buyers of these credits, there was opposition to the idea that they could be used in making claims about, you know, my product is climate neutral, or my product has low emissions, because I have purchased these credits. And again, Nadia referred to the trend away from this compensation philosophy to the idea that actually what we're doing is making a contribution, but we're not claiming it as part of our reduction commitments. So the environmental NGOs actually, they sought a prohibition in this new regulation on the use of these credits in either compliance or voluntary markets. So the compliance markets are the regulated markets, for example, like the emissions trading scheme in the European Union, and then the voluntary markets are those where largely it's companies and maybe other players who are willing to purchase these credits. In the end, the Commission said, look, we're not going to decide on the potential uses of these credits in this particular regulation. Those uses will be decided in other regulations, and in the end, that view prevailed. And it's interesting, for example, that in the revised regulation on the emissions trading scheme, so that's the trading scheme that covers all the big power and industrial installations, about 40% maybe of EU emissions covered by that. And at the moment, there is no possibility to use credits to offset some of your emissions. You have to buy the allowances that are available. But the Commission is mandated to produce a report in 2026, which would look at how permanent removals, and it very specifically relates to permanent removals, might be accounted for in the ETS, because it is clear that, for example, for cement production, for some industrial processes, we are going to have these hard-to-abate emissions even in 2050, and we will need some form of removals to compensate for those. So it's clear that it's not envisaged that these carbon farming certificates or credits would actually be allowed to offset the allowances in the emissions trading scheme. Another important limitation in the regulation is that the certificates must contribute to union climate objectives and cannot be traded with third countries. So it's not going to be possible for, let's say, Bill Gates in Microsoft to purchase these European carbon farming certificates. It will have to remain within the European Union. I now want to look at the potential market. So this comes to the final point is, what is the business case for farmers to actually participate in a voluntary carbon market and to engage in these carbon farming activities? So let's look first at the demand side. Who's going to buy these carbon farming credits? And as I say, in principle, we can say that companies might purchase credits for compliance purposes, as carbon offsets, or for what we call insetting. And just to make the point that offsetting is where a company buys credits from outside its value chain. So, for example, I'm a dairy company. I'm producing milk and other dairy products. And I might invest in one of Nadia's cook stove products in Africa. And then I might say, look, those emission reductions that I'm paying for in Africa, I'm actually going to use those to claim that my milk production is somehow more climate friendly than my competitors because I have offset some of my own emissions. So that's the idea of offsetting. The idea of insetting is where that dairy company actually undertakes activities to reduce emissions within its value chain. So its value chain, of course, includes its farmer suppliers. So if that dairy company were to introduce, for example, some incentive scheme whereby it would encourage its farmer suppliers to use feed additives or to adopt different manure management practices to cover their slurry tanks or whatever, and in that way to bring about reductions in emissions in its value chain, that's called insetting. And that's considered to be, if you like, legitimate and indeed desirable, whereas the offsetting is, as Nadia has pointed out, under considerable criticism. The first bullet point is actually incorrect. Let's just ignore that. So what we have is much greater focus by companies now on what we call their Scope 3 emissions. And this arises from another EU piece of legislation called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So this requires large companies not only to produce financial accounts, but also to produce essentially sustainability accounts. And these are set out in very detailed way, exactly the type of information that companies, in these larger companies in future will be required to produce, and it includes their climate impacts. Scope 3 emissions, just to clarify there, is, so basically we have three scopes. The Scope 1 emissions are the emissions under the direct control of the firm itself. So if I'm a dairy processor, of course, I might use natural gas to dry my milk, to convert it into milk powder. I will have a fleet of lorries going around to collect the milk from my suppliers. So those are my Scope 1 emissions. They're directly under the control of the firm itself. Scope 2 emissions are the electricity that the firm might purchase. So that's clearly not something that is directly controlled by the firm, but it is a purchase, and it will obviously have emissions associated with it. So the firm will be required to report not just its Scope 1 and 2, but then also its Scope 3 emissions. So its Scope 3 emissions are the emissions that occur anywhere else in its value chain. And that can be backwards, down the value chain. So for a dairy company, it would include all their farmer suppliers and the emissions associated with the production of the raw material. And in principle, it includes all of the upstream emissions. So for example, the fact that the milk has to be kept refrigerated in the supermarket, that is going to require power, and that also has emissions associated with it. So all of those emissions along the value chain are what we call their Scope 3 emissions, and in future, these larger companies will have to report on these. Effectively, also smaller companies will be included, because if I'm, for example, let's say I'm a small firm producing oat flakes, and I'm selling to a supermarket. The supermarket is the big company. It has to report its Scope 3 emissions. So it will want to know from me, I'm a small oat flake producer, well, what are the emissions associated with the production of your oat flakes? Because I need to know that in order that I can report my Scope 3 emissions. So it's actually quite a wide-ranging reporting exercise. It is a reporting exercise. There's no mandatory reduction associated with this, but it just means that companies are going to be much more aware of the need to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, and therefore potentially interested in purchasing credits, particularly insetting, in order to do that. However, there are other pieces of legislation which may act in the other direction. So, for example, we have, again under discussion, a so-called green claims regulation. So the Commission became very well aware that there was a lot of environmental claims being made by companies, without much evidence, without much backup. My oat flakes are more sustainable than yours, or whatever. So there's now going to be much greater demands put on companies who want to make these environmental claims in future, including climate claims. The legislation is still being discussed between the Council and the Parliament, and in particular, the European Parliament has suggested amendments which would really restrict the potential use of credits in terms of companies making climate change claims. So there will be some restrictions, and that is likely to limit the interest of companies to purchase these credits. But as I say, particularly for food companies, I think there will be a demand, particularly for these sort of insetting credits, which are considered to be, if you like, perfectly legitimate. But also to note that regulatory requirements can create a demand. And I think the French label FairCarboN is a good example of this. As I understand it, there is a requirement for airlines that are flying domestically within France. They are required to purchase credits from this scheme. And similarly, some of your remaining coal-fired power stations are required to purchase credits. Okay, that's what I need to know. I'll talk to you about how, but my point is that there is this incentive for companies over and above just, if you like, a voluntary desire to reduce emissions. There is this sort of, and I think that's one of the reasons, if I may posit it, as to why the price for carbon credits in the French scheme is clearly higher than it is in other schemes. I see I'm running out of my time, so just very quickly, let's now look at the potential farmer interest. So we've looked at the potential demand, and I've suggested there may well be a demand for these credits. Will farmers be interested? And here, essentially, farmers will be interested if they see an economic return. So essentially, it's a matter of weighing up sort of 4 factors. One is what is the likely removal, the carbon removal that I'm going to get, how many tons of carbon per year from improving my soil organic carbon content, or from planting agroforestry trees, or whatever it might be. So what's the saving I'm going to get? What is the cost of achieving that saving? So if I have to plant cover crops or plant trees, there's obviously a cost involved. What is the transaction cost on top of the actual cost of the activity? And finally, what is the price that the buyer is going to pay? And I just sort of suggest a sort of a thought experiment to kind of put some numbers on this. So let's suppose we have a practice which is going to generate removals of 1 ton of carbon per year. Okay, now for soil organic carbon, I see a huge range of figures. Eric may say something about this in a moment. Anything from 0.5 ton a year up to 3 tons a year. So 1 ton is sort of just a figure I've taken somewhere in the middle. And suppose that the associated costs of that are €60 per ton. Yeah, 60 euro per hectare. Sorry, actually, I realized that I've actually changed my units here. Oh yeah, no, I haven't. So my carbon is per hectare per year, and my costs are per hectare. Then it's clear that the carbon credit price, at least to attract the farmer, must be at least 60 euro per ton. And then, of course, you have your transactions costs. I've mentioned 2 promoters here, Indico and a French firm, Resoil, who both boast that they return 75% of the purchase price back to the farmer. So in other words, the transaction costs are 25% to cover all of that certification process. But they say that they're actually market leaders, and that in many cases projects take, maybe 40%, maybe even half of the purchase price. So all of that is taken into account. Put in your own figures, and you can see that, yeah, is it really going to be something of interest to me as a farmer? I look at, again, the same figures that Nadia has presented in terms of what the prices to date. Globally, we see these very low prices. I take my figures from a slightly different source, but they're exactly the same as Nadia's. And then the French figures obviously being somewhat higher. There is the possibility of using public support to promote, to sort of facilitate the emergence of these carbon markets. I list a number of ways here. I understand, again, to stand to be corrected, but in the Label Carbon scheme, that the actual authorities pay for the verification. Is that right? The verification costs, the transactions costs? Anyway, that's at least a possible way in which you could blend public and private financing to try to make it a more attractive scheme to the farmers. You could also think of the public sector actually getting into the market itself and purchasing these carbon credits. Of course, we do this already through the Common Agricultural Policy, not in the form of credits, because here we are paying farmers essentially for the actions that they take. So basically we pay them for planting cover crops or through the various eco schemes and so on. So we would be asking the authorities to change their practice and to move more towards a results-based scheme. So my last slide, just to summarize, of course we do need to encourage practices which remove carbon in soils and in biomass. And what role will a voluntary market play? I raised the question, will there be a continuing demand for these temporary credits? Will farmers be interested in adopting these practices and engaging in this market? Can we use public money to maybe encourage and facilitate it? And you know, a big question, if we were to move towards a more pricing system for agricultural emissions, in other words, a trading scheme, would that change the ball game completely? So thanks, Alex.